I'm happy to open the morning session, The New Journalism, How Digital Media Changed the Rules. I just want to, I forgot to tell you that you can hashtag here. You see, Free Press Con 15. There's a lot of tweeting going on, so if you guys are tweeting something, add this at the end, and then everything else comes up. You'll see there's a lot of traffic around this conference. So we're very happy about that, and it's very relevant to this morning's session. I'd like to invite Dr. Tehilla Shwartz Altshuler to open this this session with a short presentation of herself, and then she'll open up to discussion with the other panelists. Dr. Tehilla Shwartz Altshuler is a research fellow at IDI, which is the Israel Democracy Institute, where she heads the Media Reform Project and the Open Government Project. Her work at IDI includes research on policy implementation, and during 2011, Dr. Altshuler headed the Research and Development Department of the Second Authority for Radio and Television, which is the Israeli media regulator. Her main academic interests are media and telecom regulation. She's published books, articles, and policy papers on matters of media and new media policy. She holds a LLB, summa cum laude, and PhD from the law faculty at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tehilla Shwartz Altshuler.
Good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here. I could not be with you yesterday, but I did participate at the opening session, and it was extremely moving. It was something that I also spoke about with my family over late dinner Monday night. So this this session is going to be dealing with the new journalism. And I'm not a journalist, but I do look at the field of journalism and at the field of media regulation. And during the past couple of years, I started working on a little bit more I would say deeply, on the intersection of democracy and technology, and hence I started writing about open government. And it seems that if anybody thinks about the future of journalism on the one hand and the information revolution and open government on the other hand, the intersection is going to be exactly what we would like to call data journalism. And I'd like to say a few words about that, maybe about what's going on in Israel in the in this field, and then we're going to move on to the other two presentations, and perhaps we're going to have some time for questions as well. So if you want to move this slide, Chagai, you're here. Move on. So I want to open up by paying tribute to Dr. John Snow. Perhaps Professor Egglestone knows who Dr. John Snow was. He was an English physician who lived between the years 1813 and 1858, and is known as the father of epidemiology. And Dr. Snow discovered the relationship between drinking water pollution and cholera in London in the 19th century, and he did so by combining data about cholera deaths with the location of the water wells. This led to the building of London's sewage system and hugely improved the general health of the population. Why do I mention Dr. John Snow? It is because we are likely to see such developments happening again as unexpected insights flow from the combination of different open data sets. Governments are particularly significant in this respect, both because of the quantity and the centrality of the data they collect. And why is this of interest in a Freedom of the Press conference? Because when governmental big data is also open data, it's especially powerful in two most important ways. And perhaps I want to just say one word about the Freedom House, Freedom of the Press report. One of the titles that I noticed there was that freedom of information is becoming a very apparent or it takes a very apparent place within the big puzzle or within the big picture of freedom of the press. So why is this of importance? First of all, because releasing data about major governmental institutions can strengthen democracy. Chagai, you can move on with that. We're now seeing more big data about the public sector becoming available in what some have called a see-through society and others a documented democracy. So journalists and bloggers, as well as good government, civil society organizations, as I would like to consider myself, are analyzing big data that is also open data on healthcare and campaign finance and government operation and more to fuel a new era of government accountability. So it was the American Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis, who had said, publicity is justly commended as a remedy for social industrial diseases. Yeah, I know he also was quoted for that, but I didn't want to go to cliches. In terms of transparency, projects such as the Finnish tax-free, the British Where Does My Money Go, and our Israeli budget opener, you can move on, the budget opener show how tax money is being spent by the government. I myself have been involved, I would say highly involved, during the past year in an ambitious initiative to open up Israeli municipal budgets. I don't know if you know, but in Israel, a lot of mayors and municipal leaders are under criminal investigations. And one of the main reasons for that is lack of transparency in municipal budgets. The only problem is that unlike the whole country budget, the national budget, we have about 250 municipalities in Israel, and none of them in terms of the budgets looks exactly like the other. So if you want to build a platform, first of all, you need to somehow to unify the budgets, and that was our main task there. So you can move on. What we tried to do as a beginning is to take a couple of municipalities from within the Green Line and outside the Green Line, rich municipalities and poor municipalities, one Bedouin municipality, and we tried to compare the budgets so that we can learn a little bit more about that. You can move on. Each municipality at each year can see the income and the expenses, and I gave so much time and energy and money in this project, and I was so devastated to see how little people or how little numbers actually entered this important website. And then I realized that I need someone to come and look at my platform and tell a story. Because most people do not have the energy to start searching in such amazing, I have to say, a platform. So that's the one point, perhaps the democratic point. And the second point of interest, you can move with that, is that government data is very important for business. And government agencies are still the most robust source of big open data sets, and many of these have real business value. And we're talking about environmental agencies, census, health and human services, even national security and agencies. They all have great data sets with great business value. So governments, therefore, are becoming data platforms. They can become enablers, facilitators, and enhancers of both business and social opportunities because data that they aggregate
manage and store should be considered as infrastructures, just like the railway system or roads or electricity or electromagnetic frequencies. Isn't this what the whole information era or information revolution all about? But the problem is that this taxpayer-funded resources have been, I think, underutilized, largely because so much government data is so hard to use. Even if governments decide to turn data into accessible, usable, open data, or perhaps NGOs do that, as I showed you before, it cannot be implemented overnight, and it cannot get into the public directly. And frankly, for open data to move forward, perceptions need to change, and scale of adoption is required. To achieve scale of adoption, both sides, both governments and the other players, that is the media, require greater understanding of the full potential of open government. It's a classic chicken and egg challenge. So I think in order to ensure that open government does not become a hollow buzzword and lives up to the promise of its name, journalists as well as civic entrepreneurs have a role to play. They need to supply prototype that can help crystallize those opportunities. And journalists, compared to government, are more nimble and have greater freedom to experiment. And this is the critical factor in creative problem solving. So journalists should acknowledge that open public data is not a binary. Government isn't either open or closed. Public disclosure occupies a spectrum from the most adaptable data to the most inert. Adaptability may depend on not only the format of data itself, but also the prevalence and cost of human and technological capacity necessary to take advantage of it. And the more qualified data journalists we have, the less those costs are going to be. So journalists should also understand the potential of open data for public benefit and sharing these stories with the readers by creating data journalism labs and courses. So I want to give a quick example for that. I don't know if you know, but every year, I guess it happens all over the Western world at least, the Israeli Ministry of Finance publishes the annual budget booklet for the forthcoming year. This portly booklet contains thousands of pages and an endless number of tables and facts. And this booklet is one of the most important governmental documents, a primary source of knowledge about its priorities. Yet it is almost inaccessible to the general public, but rather to a small group of academic experts, which I do not consider myself as part of this group, because when I see an Excel, I start to yawn. I can promise you that. I need someone to tell me the story. So this year, after a series of talks with journalists, the financial that we at the Israel Democracy had with journalists, the financial daily newspaper Kalkalist has tried to create a pioneer project by taking this important document and making it accessible to the general public. So a team that was led by Shaul Amsterdamski, an award-winning economic investigative journalist, disassembled the budget booklet, rebuilt it, and divided it into new chapters, one that are composed of Israelis' everyday lives while depicting everything in a simple language and an accessible format. And the simple language thing was very important for me when we had those discussions before, because I said to him, the more you stick to economic jargon, the less people are going to read this or are going to enter into this project. And the most important parts of the booklet were translated into short, clear sentences that answer the most central questions of every taxpayer. Who really pays taxes and who does not? To what extent is the government depending on our consumption patterns? Why is the government lacking the interest to develop better public transportation? Why do we need to pay for private medical insurance if we have already paid for a national one? So the budget digital book is composed of 7 chapters: income, security budget, education budget, property and municipal taxes, health, public transportation, and the deficit. And it has been created as a digital product suited for the iPad version of the newspaper, and includes interactive content, videos, infographics. I just showed you a little bit because I was not sure there will be actual Wi-Fi here, so I did not trust Ori fully. And at the same time, accommodations have been made in order to place the digital book on the newspaper's website. And I have to admit that this project was well received, much better than my amazing project about the municipal budget. And there is a reason for that. One more comment before I sum up. Open public data policy should neglect the perception of service now, democracy later. And what do I mean by that? Just go back once, or maybe I just took it away. Okay, whatever. I think that a congressperson seeking to enact legislation that enables citizens to request information from government, or a data journalist or a data journalism team building the budget booklet, and a software engineer developing a tool that helps citizens understand when their street will be swept, they are all broadly working towards greater transparency, accountability, and participation in government. But they are working towards fundamentally different goals. I think that the data journalists are focused on democratizing access to public records, while the others are facilitators or facilitating public access to government service information. And the obvious explanation for that, or for why open data gets so much attention in the context of open government, is that open data in the business level is very, very sexy. It's perhaps the flashiest reform of the bunch. It's much cooler and frankly less politically controversial for any government to put government health data sets or databases online than it is for the same government to provide greater transparency around the financing of political parties. And actually, open data may even provide an easy way out for some governments to avoid a much harder and likely more transformative open government reforms that should probably be higher up on their lists. Honestly, we don't yet know what new things will become possible. New combinations of data can create new knowledge and insights, which can lead to a whole new feed of applications. But I'm convinced that this potential can be unleashed. Public data, that for this potential to be unleashed, public data needs to be open data. And this will only happen, however, if governments will change their set of mind and put time, resources, and efforts in creating the frog leap. So there's no going back. And we at the NGOs and the public activists are holding you journalists from the back. But there's no hiding the information. We think that everyone should have it. So thank you. And do you want me to continue and invite my other? Okay. Do you want me to? Okay, so a few words about the future of journalism, and we're heading on to start. Thank you. Okay. So perhaps a few words just to give a framework for this whole discussion, and then obviously I'm going to call you before I really take off the whole the whole session. So consumers, and you all know that, are engaging with a range of broadcast, print, self-scheduled, and wider online content. Newspapers are not just printed but online and carry video packages with the look and feel of traditional television. Broadcasters publish websites, including text-based articles, similar to online print offerings. Scheduled programs are broadcast but also available on demand, both on digital channels and on a variety of websites. User-generated materials vies for online audiences alongside professionally produced content, and professional and amateur bloggers share the same debates. And you can access everything. You can access via PC, smartphone, and tablet device, regulated, unregulated content, licensed and unlicensed services. I have to admit, I come from the media regulation field, so everything that is not regulated is really, really scare me. They're all becoming impossible to differentiate. And some material is subject to comprehensive rules set down by parliaments, some to lighter touch co-regulation, some to voluntary self-regulated rules, some to no regulatory authority at all. So if it were for me, we would emphasize the point that current regulation and the piecemeal attention of recent inquiries and consultations fail to address the democratic value in enabling the citizen to navigate and evaluate a range of journalism and other content, be it partial or impartial, regulated or unregulated, with public service commitments or purely commercial ambitions, and whether derived from broadcasting, print, video on demand, or traditional news sites or social media. So without a coherent regulatory approach, citizens cannot base their expectations of content on any consistent framework. They cannot sensibly evaluate its credibility, nor make informed judgments about engagement with it, nor can they differentiate regulated and unregulated content in any meaningful way. What does this mean for democracy, for the press itself, fulfilling its role as the fourth estate? So those questions, I think, should remain as the framework for discussion, for discussing this frightening yet exciting changes in the landscape of journalism. So we will open our discussion with David Horovitz, who is... Do you want to start? Oh, okay. So Professor Paul Egglestone, who is the chair of Digital and Creative Technology at the director of Media Innovation Studio, University of Central Lancashire. A former independent TV producer working with, for the BBC, ITV, and Sky, Paul now focuses on digital storytelling. And Paul will discuss the dawn of digital and how the emergence of new platforms has undermined, not to say destroyed, the traditional business model for journalism, whilst at the same platform are also open to anyone and everyone wishing to commit random acts of journalism. I love this random acts of journalism phrase. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for that introduction and those inspiring kind of start to this kind of session, thinking about kind of big data. I was just about to put up my first or second slide, actually, which is a shot of the Media Innovation Studio that you've just been introduced to, and was thinking about something that we did on about 12 months ago now within the studio. I set a group of journalists, not journalism students, professional journalists, a question. And if I can have that first slide, okay, that would be great. Here's the question that they were asked at in the Media Innovation Studio, a challenge. Data.gov.co.uk contains more than 7,200 data sets from 7 governmental publishers, including 784 from the Department for Communities and Local Government. Working in small interdisciplinary groups, take one of those data sets from a department or from the Department for Communities and Local Government and present it visually. And the conversation stopped there as people began to realise the journalists in the room, they don't have the skills to do the stuff they need to do. And that's a big concern for us in journalism as we start to engage in that information technology and that intersection that you so beautifully described, in that governments can be transparent, apparently, in terms of pushing all this open data out there, although there's big questions over what standards that data actually arrives in. Is it a standard that is a uniform standard? I've described 7,200 data sets. I happen to know there were over 600 standards within that, so you'd have had to be a rocket scientist plus to get to grips with any of that kind of challenge we set the team originally. Just go back one, just to see the smiling, happy... Sorry, back the other way, mate, just to go, so that's it. So that's the actual the people in the room trying to grapple with this question around kind of data sets and understanding that they didn't probably have all the necessary skills to be able to deal with that. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge whether we're trying to persuade people to just to get online, to use materials online, and to have the appropriate skills to make sure that they can service democracy better in the future. Okay, the next slide is just a little telling you what you already know about what's been happening in the press, basically, and then kind of further down, media. Since the 17th century, newspapers have been published. We kind of know that. And by the sort of 20th century, they sorted out their business model. They understood that subscription models or cover fee models or advertising models made up their kind of revenue streams. Next slide, please. Then in 1981, it kind of all changed and brought a new set of challenges with it. And those challenges fundamentally hit at the consumer in the first place, the audience. How do we access news online, or how do we access this digitally? Of course, in the same vein, it hit the news industry by recognising that they got a staff team who'd been very, very used to producing news in what we would call a linear format. For kind of print or even for television is a linear format essentially, would now have to start to work in a different way, in a kind of non-linear way, where people borrowed little bits and pieces and put together their own kind of tapestry of demanded a new set of skills within the newsroom. Nobody has any understanding still properly of how this stuff is paid for. Yeah, and it's certainly back then there was a lot of head scratching going on, wondering about maybe we should all dash towards digital, dash towards online, but we have no idea what we're building here and whether there'll ever be any financial return. And why is that important? Because of course it funds the activities that promote, support and defend democracy. So a decent, robust, independent media does rely on having an ecosystem surrounding it and an economy surrounding it that allows that process to take place. Next slide, please. This was the response from the industry, slow, inevitably, as people began to understand, and there was a lot of scepticism, of course, about whether this online, this new World Wide Web thing would ever really catch on. That I remember that really well in one or two newsrooms that I populated at the time. People put up paywalls. They decided that they wouldn't put up paywalls, that they would make money on print and just allow people to use the web portal as a gateway to their kind of print products. But then, of course, they started to develop some new skills. We've trained in the Media Innovation Studio BBC journalists in cross-platform content creations many, many years ago. We currently train two of our biggest regional newspaper organisations, Trinity Mirror and Johnston Press. We've trained 600 Johnston Press journalists, and we're going through the same kind of project with Trinity Mirror as we develop their digital strategy with their chief executive and work out what it means to be a journalist in the modern age. So yes, there are little bits of coding, and you can imagine how well that goes down on a Monday morning in the Media Innovation Studio. Next slide, please. Citizen journalism. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about some projects that we've done. I've already mentioned that we do a fair amount of industry training. This is a project that we started back in about 2008. It was called Bespoke. It was set on a community estate in Preston, and we worked with a large research council in the UK who funded us to engage people in telling stories about their own environment, not because it was a citizen journalism project per se, but because we were interested in working out whether we could help them tell their stories, and if they told their stories, whether we could connect those stories to people who might have the resources the authority, the kind of power, the wherewithal to make a difference to their lives on that particular estate. Of course, as we were doing that, we worked also with Nokia and developed a mobile application for journalism. There's a shot of that coming up. And we worked with the community to develop their own newspaper. The newspaper is just it's their choice, their words, their design, even their title. They produce 2,500 of these every month. They wanted to do it weekly, but there was nowhere near enough news happening on that estate by any standards to manage a weekly. And I think actually by the time they realised how complex the production process was, they would have been struggling to do that, even with our assistance. But we took no editorial responsibility for this other than making sure that people weren't libeling or defaming people, and because there was a web version as well, and occasionally correcting spelling, but that's about as much as we managed on that process. Next slide shows the mobile application that we developed to assist the community in telling their stories. It was based around a Nokia N95. That cloud-based system probably is there now, looks pretty kind of dated now, but at the time was kind of revolutionary because we hadn't been thinking about what the cloud might be and what that might mean, and we just data needed to be stored somewhere else. And essentially the mobile device, which the Nokia N95, you could take video on it, you could record audio on it, you could type some text on it, and then you could send that information to our server system and it would present it on a website. Again, all that sort of stuff is matter of fact these days, yeah? We tested it in Africa, and we tested it with the British journalists embedded with the troops in Camp Bastion, and we found that it was a robust enough system, but very, very expensive. Yeah, the infrastructure required to make some of this kind of stuff happen. The big promise of digital is that it always comes at a cost. It always comes at a cost, and in those days, those costs were actually far too high for what we were trying to achieve. But there was, say, an application developed to support and assist journalists in journalism as part of that project. Next slide, please. I'm going to leap to a project that's got nothing to do with us, but informed a lot of our thinking. Back in 2008, Ushahidi developed this particular website over in Kenya. Violence erupted, as some of you will know who are Kenyan or African, everybody ought to know really, 2008 Kenyan elections when Mia Kibaki was declared the winner in the face of charges of vote rigging from supporters of his challenger Raila Odinga. It soon spread across ethnic lines, and we kind of know what happens next. There was a fair amount of bloodshed, but it took not a journalist but a lawyer, Orva Kohler, to pull together technologists, bloggers and people who understood this kind of new digital era that we were entering into, to work out whether they could record any acts of violence in some of the kind of locations around the Kibera area, because they recognised that they weren't getting that information through quickly enough in real time from the formal channels, yeah, from whether that was kind of military spokespeople, police press officers, etc., etc. There was a dearth of access to that data. So he decided that ought to come from the community, and fairly quickly built this map with in fact, I believe it was a sort of 24-hour job. The supporters got together and built something that enabled the documentation of violence, extreme violence in Kenya. And if that's not a really good example of how the web can use the technology to bring together and create some of the stories on the back of it and provide in an open and transparent way access to information for journalists who would still need to verify it, they would still need to kind of qualify it, they would still need to interpret it, and all those kind of other issues that go with the traditional act of journalism are kind of still there. But it's a starting point that starts to breathe a new life into an opportunity that digital provides. Next slide, please, and we're back into a project that we were involved with, not off the bus. Some of you may have heard of ProPublica and may not have heard of Amanda Michael, but Amanda Michael set up Off the Bus for the Huffington Post, which was essentially one of the first kind of large crowdsourced digital journalism projects, yeah? I met Amanda in New York back in 2008. On the back of that particular project, she just developed something else called Adopt a Stimulus. The Obama administration had just come to power, and of course there was the global world crisis, and in order to kind of prop up the dollar, Obama decided that they would build infrastructure projects and so on and so forth. You know, again, the wisdom or not of the economic policies, neither here nor there. That's what happened, and Amanda Michael commissioned about 3,500 citizens to just report on the progress that was being made with various initiatives across the states. Yeah, I was attracted to her approach because it used that crowdsourced approach, but it also used a really clever little piece of cross-referencing. She would pick 5 or 6 community journalists in each city, and she would send them a slightly different brief, so that when the stories came back from those individuals, she could triangulate and corroborate the stories and go back to those citizens where there were discrepancies and check some of that information. Yeah. Now, she told me that she picked up that technique, if that's what it was, from the Off the Bus project. So I kind of shared that notion and that idea with a number of colleagues at the BBC, and we set up a project called MELD that started to look at how we change the relationship between the newsroom and people in the newsroom and their audience out there. Rather than seeing citizen journalists as they're all coming here and taking our jobs, it's a threat, it's a threat, it's a threat, and it's not very good, and so on and so forth. It was basically, look, you know, whether you like it or not, you can't hold back this tide. This is kind of going to happen, and we think it's going to happen more quickly. And actually, 1 or 2 of these people have access to knowledge and expertise that it would be very difficult for you to have, because 1, you're not there on the location, and 2, you may not be, you know, a brain surgeon or a rocket scientist. You're a journalist, and they happen to be a brain surgeon and a rocket scientist, so they might know more about this subject than you. Let's open the kind of doors and try and work out how we can shift that relationship slightly using digital to do that. Next slide, please. So then, we're into now, you know, the early kind of, in fact, that was 2008. We're already into things like kind of Facebook and YouTube, about to kind of witness the dawn of Twitter, and not really sure as journalists whether this is a friend or a foe. And you can look at it through either side, from either side, and create robust arguments for both. Yeah, and I have kind of no problem as an academic sitting down and having conversations with people about the goods and the bads of social media. One thing that, to misquote Bill Clinton, that is absolutely kind of fundamental about this is that, so the misquote for Bill Clinton, it's about the platform, stupid. Yeah, it's the platform, stupid. This is where the eyeballs are, and this is where people are exchanging stuff, regardless of what's happening in the dominant, formal, regulated media channels. This stuff is happening. Yeah, and we're either part of that conversation, or we're not part of that conversation. Yeah, or more than likely, it's less than binary, we're part of bits of it, but the bits that we're part of rely entirely on our willingness and ability to engage. Yes, okay, so fairly recently, since kind of March anyway, it's been in plans apparently for the last 12 months, Facebook have offered to host newspapers' websites, and they've offered to host newspapers' websites and retain the branding and so on and so forth. What do I think about that? I'm asked on a fairly regular basis, and I say, do you know what? It'd be a great money spinner for the news industry, but they're going to have to give up the relationship that they've got with the audience, that they've spent lots and lots of time cultivating, that has become their, again, I use this word hesitantly, but their brand. Yeah, it's part of their identity. So it's okay taking the money from Facebook, but if Facebook then take your audience and do something else with it a little bit later that you perhaps doesn't reflect your brand, maybe that's a bad thing. Again, love it or hate it, it's here to say because it is so big, and if I could sort of be ever so critical, I think, and plenty of colleagues in journalism would agree with this, newspapers particularly, television to some degree, failed so significantly to invest in things like information computing technology when it was all beginning to happen, that they're now left working out how they fit within the remaining space, rather than kind of if you like, controlling or owning that dialogue. And with some justification. You know, if they've spent millions and millions of pounds on printing presses and still waiting for 20 years to get a return on them, it's very difficult to go to the bank and say, actually, we've changed our minds, we don't want some printing presses, we want ICT's the future. Okay, next slide. So, an interface, I think, and this brings us back into that conversation around data journalism, really. I had a quick look when I arrived in Jerusalem for a hacks and hackers group in Jerusalem. I couldn't find one, but I found 15 in Tel Aviv. Yeah, so yeah, so and that was just me googling hacks and hackers meetups. Yeah, and why do I think these people are important? Well, here's something that I wrote. Kind of, I'll quote it pretty much verbatim. Hacks and Hackers is a digital community of practice made up of people who get together to inspire each other, share information, collaborate to invent the future of journalism. These people are not journalists, yeah? Or not all of them are journalists. Some of them are, but they are inspired. They understand or want to perpetrate the values of journalism. They want to practice journalism, yeah? Exploring technologies to filter, visualise, distribute information and tell stories through bar camps, unconferences, social media cafes, data dives, and by tapping into growing international hacks and hackers networks, they are shifting the definition of a journalist from somebody who reports for a newspaper or broadcaster to somebody who can acquire, publish and analyse important digital online source documents, yeah? That's a fundamental shift. And when I sit in most newsrooms and say, let's have a hackathon, again, it's met with blank stares, yeah? As you one might well imagine. And it's not just in newsrooms, it's in universities as well, as you'd be unsurprised to hear, yeah? The growth of the civic hacking community shows that those involved in the preparation, dissemination, interpretation of open data on one level identify with the roles and responsibilities traditionally associated with journalists, and in many cases they'll assume that role. The Hacks and Hackers movement reflects a community built on the recognition of those shifting boundaries. Scattered through the worlds of journalism and technology live a growing number of professionals interested in developing technology to serve that mission of journalism. Now, we can either engage with these groups, that always makes them sound like the other. They're not the other, they're part of us, they're part of the communities that we live in. They more than likely have people who live next door doing exactly the same thing. But they are definitely the type of people that you need to sit in your newsroom to assist you with working out how we parse data to produce applications like, next slide please, like this one that was produced for the Daily Telegraph by one of my team after Sir Ranulph Fiennes just a few weeks ago around the Marathon des Sables, and we put biometric sensors across his body, and we put a satellite phone nearby, and we're able to take the data from him as he ran the Marathon des Sables. I was slightly nervous when his manager told me that he'd already suffered 2 heart attacks before. I should have checked that on my ethics form before I actually embarked in the process. And the project but Sir Ranulph finished, and each day, working with Kingston University, they analysed the data and the journalists wrote the stories for the Telegraph to connect the data and the additional stuff into journalism. It takes a multidisciplinary team. Again, I'm asked, should journalists code? I don't know. It depends whether they've got a natural aptitude to code. Yeah, if they think that they'd like to code, let's let them code. You know, if they think they just like to tell stories, let's get them to tell stories, but let's get them to work with coders so that if they've got a great story and a coder says, well, have you thought we could do this with it? We could do that with it. There's a beautiful new relationship, not to mention a new economic model and a new set of jobs for our industry, which is obviously had a hit in most kind of newsrooms over the years, wherever you are in the world, pretty much. There are new opportunities there that the brave new world of the internet do provide. A couple more slides, and I'm going to finish with a little video. Next slide, please. I saw one of these last night. I left here. Did you see it? I'd no battery left in my phone because I'd been talking to Hirsch Goodman, and he said, drone journalism, it's great, we should have invested in drone journalism, but they'd get shot down here. And last night I was kind of stood waiting for this thing being shot down over the old city or something. Yeah, he flew illegally, way out of sight over the city and back. Oh, I've no idea. It may well have done. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know, but I just saw the drone, and it was definitely a DJI Phantom, which is a a kind of community hobbyist kind of drone rather than a professional quality drone, and it disappeared, and it came back again. And somebody who runs a civic drone centre at the university, I did find that slightly perturbing, to be perfectly honest with you, but nevertheless, it's part of this from Ben Kramer, who runs African Sky Cam with a guy called Dickens Holloway, who are good colleagues and friends of ours, who've been using drones like this one, in fact this particular drone over in Kenya, to do a number of things. We develop software platforms. We've got a software platform, for example, that can count the number of people in a crowd from about 400 metres, which I guess the military would really, really like, but we'd like to keep it for ourselves, because we'd like journalists to be able to report more accurately on where there's movements of people, where you get those kind of odd statistics from a police spokesman or a military spokesman that you might want to triangulate with some of your own data. Yeah. So we're not particularly interested in building the platforms; they're already there. We're interested in developing the software and applications to do all that kind of stuff. And the last couple of slides. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit out there, because one of the things that I keep saying to journalists is the thing about the digital revolution is that it is exactly that, but unfortunately, like most revolutions, it doesn't finish with a, I don't know, whatever it might be, beheading of a Louis, whoever it might be, and then it's all over, yeah? It's a continual kind of thing. This looks pretty uninspiring when I see this online. It's a piece that we've done for the Liverpool Echo, one of our local newspapers, when one of our Premiership football players, Steven Gerrard, for anybody who's supports Liverpool or has even heard of them. That was a big noise over there in the UK just a couple of weeks ago. This is a piece of interactive print, yeah? This is print, it's ordinary paper. The balls that you can see are linked to this part here. When you touch on the footballs, you hear the sound of the crowd roaring and Steven Gerrard talking about how he scored that particular goal in 1970, whenever it was. Yeah. So the 8 goals, the best career bests of Steven Gerrard, is a prototype that's now in production using conductive ink and trying to breathe new life into print. Yeah. So beyond just thinking about, we're a research centre. Yeah. Yeah. That's a print. That's a print. I'm going to show you a video. And then you can ask me questions, perhaps over coffee later, and we'll talk about big data and stuff like that. Let's move on. I'll show you another quick example of why we started to do this. Yeah, we thought that actually one of the things that the web always has over print is that we can get acres and acres of statistics about who's viewing what, how long are they using it. We only have to go into Google Analytics to find our various kind of scores and so on and so forth. So we thought if we developed a platform that worked in tandem with print, so that every time somebody touched on a piece of print, we knew where they were touching, and we knew how long they were touching for, and we knew what they were listening to, that would be maybe useful to people in terms of securing their economic model or giving them another product that they might be able to sell as part and parcel of that. So I'll finish with a video, I think that's the next slide, of what that is now, actually. Thank you.
There's something really nice about paper, its unique qualities, properties and affordances. The digital age is changing the industries that traditionally had paper as their medium. They're moving from paper to screen. We've been exploring the use of printed electronics like conductive inks to enhance and transform the experience of newsprint. For instance, a magazine could hold all its articles as well as surrounding content in the form of audio.
Has the ideas machine broken down? The idea that innovation and new technology...
If it was connected, readers could listen to new updated content related to a story and engage with content through voting. If readers could log in, they could share content and receive personal recommendations. Additionally, we've been exploring business and advertising models, specifically around analytics that could now exist in print. These explorations have been possible due to the advances in conductive ink technologies. In a few years, all the connectivity required for interactive print could exist on a single printed label, and when this happens, the relationships between paper, print, and digital will change once again.
Thank you, Paul, for this unbelievable presentation. And now I am going to invite Mr. David Horovitz, who is the founding editor of the Times of Israel, former editor of the Jerusalem Post and the Jerusalem Report. And David will elaborate on the actual transformation from traditional to digital types of journalism. He will talk about his past and then explain the motivation to move to new formats, maybe alternative to traditional journalism, maybe addition to it, just an adjustment, and describe the way, the obstacles, the opportunities, and the transition from running a print paper to a 24/7 website. I'm gonna close this.
Thank you. Okay, hi everybody. First of all, thank you for inviting me to speak to this group. And second of all, I have to say I feel a bit like a coal miner after that previous presentation. I've never heard of. Had you all heard of conductive ink? Yeah. Am I like? I mean, that last thing was just staggering to me. And in a way, I got to tell you, a little bit like encouraging, because I suppose I'm a traditional journalist at heart, and I love print journalism, and I run a website that has no print component, and I kind of miss it. And if there are opportunities to do things that kind of take us back in a way to that kind of interaction with readers, I find that fascinating. So I'll speak a little bit about myself and what I was doing, what I am doing, the environment in which I work. I feel we had two very overview-ish presentation. So again, the coal mining metaphor is relevant. I'm at the coal face, actually, sort of doing this journalism thing. I want to give you a sense of what that's like. And broadly speaking, towards the end, I want to impress upon you my sense of crisis in journalism as I understand it, because I think our industry, with all the opportunities that technology offers, I think fundamentally the profession is still in crisis with tremendous negative implications for democracy. So first of all, I grew up in traditional journalism. I grew up in London. I was a very bad pupil at school. I didn't study hard at all. I went to my A-levels, which is the things you do at 18 in England en route to university, without having read most of the material that I was supposed to be answering questions about. I got very bad results in my A-levels. I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. And if I'd gone to university, I probably would have gone to study economics, because that seemed to be the thing I was least bad at. Not remotely interested in, but least bad at. And then one morning, I don't even know why, I was reading the Daily Mirror, which is a not particularly good British newspaper with a fine tradition. And there was an ad for journalism school. It was a pre-university one-year course in journalism. I had never thought that I would do journalism. I thought I was, like I said, relatively better at economics than anything else, but pretty lousy at everything. I'd studied English literature not seriously. I'd never thought that I could write particularly. I saw this ad. I have no idea to this day why I applied to this ad. And I got into this journalism course, which was taught in Cardiff in Wales. And the first week that I went to that course, I thought, oh my God, this is fantastic. This is what I should be doing and want to be doing. I kind of, by complete fluke, found what I think was my vocation. So I finished this course. I worked in London for less than a year on a local paper, and then I moved to Israel. I went to Hebrew University during the day, and I started working at the Jerusalem Post at night, and loved it, and worked at the Post for many years. Then was with the team that founded a bi-weekly magazine, which, by the way, still exists, called the Jerusalem Report. And even when we started, which was 1990, and it started as a weekly, then it became a bi-weekly, fortnightly publication. We were challenged by the fact that you're in Israel, first of all, where everything changes all the time within minutes, and who knows what's been happening in the half an hour that we've been sitting in this room, for goodness sake. And you're producing a bi-weekly publication. So the challenge, even, what are we talking about, 25 years ago, was to make something that would have any relevance certainly 2 weeks after much of its content was started upon, even more since some stories were initiated. That was challenging. I worked there for a long, long time. Then I worked at the Jerusalem Post, which is a daily paper. And the Jerusalem Post had been around forever. It was founded in 1932. It was actually called the Palestine Post until the late 1940s. And I went there and I was the editor there from 2004 to 2011. Now, the Jerusalem Post, it's very relevant for some of the things that we're talking about, is a traditional print journalistic enterprise with a decades-long history and incredibly resonant brand that by the time I was editor and some years before that, and certainly now, gets the immensely overwhelming proportion of its readership, not on the print edition, but online. In other words, if you're reading, which I'm sure is the case for almost every newspaper, even newspapers with, there may be parts of the world where this is not the case, but in my understanding, newspapers transitioned to the internet. They put their content online in various ways with various degrees of free access or paid access and so on. And as far as I know, and this was the economic model that I understood, they've kept their print editions alive and as robust as possible for as long as they can, because the relative revenue of somebody buying your print edition as opposed to somebody reading numerous articles on your website, well, your print edition is much more economically viable, even nowadays, right? So the Jerusalem Post, which had and has this vast internet audience, the print edition was nonetheless, even though it's relatively quite small, nonetheless economically fairly central. The psychology for me as an editor there, again, we're talking 2004 to 2011, so deep into the era where everybody is essentially consuming their news online. For me as an editor, even though I knew that 90x% of our traffic, of our readership was coming to the newspaper online, for me, the focus was on the print edition, and I allowed myself the crucial psychological mindset that once a day at about 11:30 or midnight, we would close the newspaper, and I would feel a sense of relief that the job was done, and we'd done our best to produce the best newspaper we could produce in that 24 hours. And now there'd be a bit of a break before the next morning we'd all come in and start trying to do it again, which is a completely delusional mindset, obviously, because the website was running 24/7, and the newspaper essentially was a snapshot of what the journalists had managed to achieve, a rather incidental snapshot. That at press time, that's what we'd managed to get into the paper, whereas while the internet site rolled inexorably on. I think if I had tried to directly manage the website, probably it would have been impractical. Maybe I could have delegated more effectively. Maybe I would have needed more staff. But to me, it was crucial in my own mindset. I was worrying about the print edition. Obviously, the internet site was functioning. The material that was coming into the print paper was going up online as well. But that was crucial to me. I worried primarily about the print edition. Closed the print edition every day. Had that few hours of relaxation. Now, they say you should be sort of careful what you wish for, because a few years ago, I quit the Jerusalem Post, and I found an investor who was prepared to partner me in setting up the Times of Israel. I spoke to people who had initiated new products. I spoke to people who had built websites that also had a print component as well. I spoke to people at Politico, for example. Politico, as I'm sure all of you know, very, very potent Washington-based website that also has a print edition that I think comes out, certainly not every day, several days a week, where the print publication is sustained because there's a lot of lobby advertising, and therefore there was a print financial justification. I haven't been able to find a financial justification for doing a print edition of the Times of Israel, and therefore, me, the editor who didn't really want to think about the internet edition as being the mainstay of what he was doing at the Jerusalem Post, now run an internet-only publication where I can no longer delude myself that there is any downtime at all. And again, to speak as someone who feels sort of on the cold face here, the 24/7-ness of running a website is an incredibly challenging thing. And I don't know, I went to see the guy who was editing the New York Times a few years ago, and his wife happened to come in, and he just told me that he tries to get home every night around 8 o'clock, and she sort of caught the tail end of that sentence as she came to the office and rolled her eyes and laughed. What he's giving you that line about, going home in the evenings, of course, it never ends. Now, I have a really good staff of people, but the 24/7-ness of modern journalism is incredibly wearing. I'll add to it the particular challenge of running a website called the Times of Israel in English makes that 24/7 aspect even more challenging, in that probably most of our readership now is in North America. So at midnight in Israel, when you're exhausted, it's 5 o'clock in New York and it's 2 o'clock in LA. And lots of your readers are deep in the middle of their day and they want to know what's going on. By the way, we cover Israel and the Middle East and the Jewish world. There's always material. And therefore, the 24/7-ness of it is not, just doing a little bit of tinkering in the night time. It's being aware that for a lot of your readers, this is the middle of the day and they need to have good content brought to them 24/7. So that, for me, very challenging. The way we built the site, Chagai, if you could just scroll down half a screen, that would be good. You can erase it. That's enough. That's fine. As you've already gathered, I'm kind of a snobbish, traditionalist, old-fashioned journalistic-y type. And when I was setting up the site, I went to see lots of people and said, to people who build websites, and said, I want to start this new website, and here's what I want to do, and here are the buttons that I want on this site. And 5 of the 6 companies that I went to listened to me very politely and wrote down what I wanted, and then told me how much it would cost for me to have them do it. And the 6th company was a guy who rode up to meet me on a bicycle and met me at a cafe in Tel Aviv and started arguing with me right away. And said, well, that's not going to work, and you shouldn't do that, and that's ridiculous, and that's not a bad idea. And he's a guy called Greg Davidovich, and he runs a company called RGB Media, with whom I built the site. And that was the best decision I ever made. And just, some things that are interesting to me and might be interesting to you. We have, just here is that on that, it's a 6-column constructed website. The right-hand column at the top, actually we happen to have a story across the top now on 6 columns. That's a light-ish feature story. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a second. But on the far right column, there is something called Latest Blogs. And what we did with the site was a combination of very traditional journalism, which is my sort of outlook, and Greg, I'm the elitist and he's the anarchist. And the anarchy part is the blog platform, and basically it's wide open to, I don't know what you want to call it, citizen journalism. The combination was very potent. When we were starting the site, it was one of the reasons why the site flew very quickly, very early on, because people are writing blogs, they're posting blogs on our website, they're sending the URL around to everyone who they know, who they want to read what they are writing, and therefore they were drawing attention to the site. We actually opened the blog platform a couple of days before we opened the main part of the site, and it was, like I say, an incredibly potent and effective way of marketing the site. I mean, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, to start a brand new journalistic enterprise with essentially not spending any money on marketing would have been ridiculous, and that's what we did. We didn't spend any remotely serious amount of money on marketing, and the blog platform was a part of that. Among the other things that I tried to do was, again, because of my background, and I think, I don't know, there are certain conflicting trends in the industry about how to set up the homepage of a website. I wanted to bring some of the print journalistic values to a website. So in other words, if a story is really important, it shouldn't merely be the lead story on the site, but if it's really important, it could go across the whole width of the site. That there should be a difference between a feature story and a news story that you would see immediately, that you can have stories with smaller and larger pictures and so on. And a lot of those things that we did, we're talking 3.5, 4 years ago when we were designing the site, were fairly unusual at the time, are much more commonplace now, but that was quite important to me. What we have really at the Times of Israel, and I don't know enough about enough other sites about how they work, but essentially we're doing the equivalent of remaking the front page of a traditional newspaper all the time. It's not just the last story to have been published that's at the top of the site. The news editor who's running the site is constantly adapting the hierarchy of the site and choosing what goes up the top and what moves down and how far does it move down and so on. And I don't know, I'd be interested to speak to you afterwards, Paul. There are choices that you make about, this is a very link light top of the site, I would say. In other words, the top screen or the top 2 screens of our website are not overflowing with links to articles in the way that many other sites, certainly among them the New York Times are. The Guardian, which seems to me to be very intent on innovation all the time, is somewhere in between. The world's most successful English language news site, I think, the Mail, has something not radically dissimilar to our approach in that it has this incredibly long homepage, and we kind of bet on that. We kind of bet that technology would make it very easy to scroll down the page, and that if you presented your material with nice pictures and presented it attractively graphically, that was worth doing at the expense of not having so many links in so condensed a space high up the page. Just to give you a sense, I don't know how many of you are traditional journalists or how many of you are academics looking at traditional journalism. The reality of the kind of journalism that we do, where you have the luxury of editing and working hard on analytical and feature stories, at the same time you also have this imperative to break news quickly. Right? If you're a breaking news site, which we are, as well as a feature analysis and an opinion site, you've got to do it fast. If you're not going to do it fast, you're not in the game. For me, one of the reasons, again, why the Times of Israel worked was the combination of you need to go to the site all the time if you want to know what's going on, and then you're also going to read some of the richer material. All journalists who are doing anything like that are challenged by the conflict between wanting to be fast and wanting to be accurate. Okay, so the more accurate you are, by definition, I'm afraid, the longer it's going to take you to post your material. Right? The faster you are, the less accurate you're going to be. And that's a real challenge that you know you try somehow to find a balance. One of the ways that you can find a balance, of course, is to publish very little material when a story is breaking, so that you're covering it, you're telling people to be aware of something, and then you can hopefully be accurate as you expand what you're doing on that story. But that's a huge challenge that journalism has always had to deal with. Except that you had, you know, relative luxuries of a print edition, a daily schedule, and so on. Now you're talking about second to second. The scrutiny, of course, you're doing that under constant scrutiny, and you're doing under constant scrutiny of people who are sometimes constructive and good-hearted, and scrutiny of people who are sometimes destructive and ill-intentioned. So, for example, when there was the terrorist attack at the Har Nof synagogue in Israel not too many months ago, and at CNN they reported it initially as, I think they said it was a shooting in a mosque. Am I right? Yeah. That, you know, there are people who think, well, that just proves that, you know, CNN are a bunch of anti-Semites, and maybe there are lots of anti-Semites at CNN. I have no idea about that, but I can't believe that was motivated by anti-Semitism. Much more likely that it was a function of getting the story up very, very quickly, and maybe there were some misconceptions and some wrong assumptions that stems from some very problematic worldviews. But the potential for really major error in a journalistic world where we're balancing that desire for speed with accuracy, the potential is immense. And it doesn't matter. I'm sure CNN had corrected their story. I would like to think they'd corrected their story fairly rapidly. But there's the constant scrutiny up against that constant challenge to be fast, and that produces error and produces all kinds of sometimes correct and sometimes incorrect interpretations of why something has been done. In many cases, I'm sure in most cases of journalistic error online, the British expression is cock up rather than conspiracy. It's usually stupidity rather than malice, which I think is probably the closest I can get to in American English. It's a function of the environment in which we're operating. Another yeah. Okay, sure. Another reality of the internet, of journalism in the crazy world of the internet is I'll give you sort of a semi-example. The New York Times, for example, I'm not thinking of a specific case, can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars and put its journalists at potential risk, sending them to a very fraught part of the world, and have them spend a week or 2 weeks there and have them write a series of incredible articles that go to the very essence of what is unfolding, and have them come back, and they'll write these pieces and they'll post them on the New York Times. Like I said, they'll have invested a fortune, they'll have put journalists at potential risk, they'll have done really good journalism. And another website can condense that material, give it a more sensationalist headline, attribute it to the New York Times, acknowledge that this material comes from the New York Times, put up 5 or 6 paragraphs, and hijack, if you like, a significant proportion of the traffic for that material with no investment whatsoever. You guys know as well as I do, you can think of sites around the world, some of which I may already have mentioned, whose whole business model is built on taking other people's material, redoing it, packaging it with a more sensationalist headline and so on, and hijacking the traffic. That's, you know, another aspect of the crazy world. You're in a world where economically, whether you've got a paywall or whether you're relying on ads on a page, you have to boost traffic. You want to maximize your traffic. And among the other balances, the balance of accuracy against speed, there's also the balance between material that you know will garner traffic and material that goes to the core reason of why you're in the business in the first place. So when you're looking at analytics and you're looking at who's reading which stories, which are your most read stories, first of all, it destroys your faith in human nature, I have to tell you. It really does. It's a very depressing reality, because the fact is, I can tell you from behind the Times of Israel, that if we wanted to maximize traffic, broadly speaking, we should write about sex, archaeology, and household pets. Okay, that's the magic trifecta. And in fact, a few months ago, last year, at the Israel Museum, they had an exhibition. Our headline on it was 4,000-year-old erotica depicts a strikingly racy ancient sexuality. So in that headline, if you're following with me, you've got the archaeology and the sex. And actually some of this material that was on exhibition at the Israel Museum, I think there were even animals in some of the plaster plaques. So that actually we had the magic trio of sex, archaeology, and domestic pets. And the traffic for that, and it was a genuine article, I have to tell you. It was not a sensationalist traffic engendering naked bid for readership. It was a very serious, responsible exhibition put up by the Israel Museum, but it was, you know, a very widely read article. And you find yourself as an editor looking for that balance, remembering what your core mission is, but being aware that if you word something differently or if you do that story, you know, your traffic's going to rise. And you see some of the, you know, the websites that would like to think of themselves as tremendously serious and responsible websites trending down that road. You know, you see the top 10 lists appearing on websites that 5 years ago would not have dreamed of running top 10 lists because of the financial imperative. So I just want to sum up onto the crisis front, okay? Because for all the innovation that Paul spoke about, which is fascinating, I don't know that anybody's cracked the economic model of journalism in the internet age. I don't know that anybody's found the way. Basically, we committed commercial suicide in our profession, right? We gave away our product. We thought, oh, the whole world can read what we're doing. Let's give it to them. Now we want people to start paying for it again, and that's an incredibly challenging and, to my mind, so far unproven path. And therefore, the financial viability of journalism as I know it, I still don't see the model that works effectively, instead of which you see business interests coming into journalism, you see newspapers being taken over and owned by people with particular interests, whether it's business interests or political interests. You find yourself increasingly in journalism having to read journalism and look at journalism through a filter where you first have to ask yourself, well, who owns this channel or this website or this journalistic enterprise? Why are they highlighting this? Why are they playing that down? The Israelis in the audience, you know that. You know that if you're reading Yisrael Hayom, you have to read it through the filter of who owns Yisrael Hayom and what's their political agenda. The same goes for Haaretz and lots of other newspapers as well. Part of that is because of the financial crisis that has harmed independent journalism. And I have to say, I told you how I got into this profession. I think it's noble. I think journalism is a noble profession. I think that if you don't have effective independent journalism, your democracy is not going to function effectively, because if people feel that they can accumulate power without being effectively policed, and journalism needs to be that watchdog, and journalism is increasingly unable, in my opinion, financially, to police democracies or to act as a watchdog in democracies effectively, then you have a recipe for corruption and for the undermining of democracy. So I think it's not just a financial challenge for journalism, it's a challenge for the robust nature of democracy. And at the very cutting edge, when you're trying to staff a website, and you know that people don't go into journalism anymore because you can earn double working for a PR company that's producing material to be sent to journalists. So, it's ever harder, I think, to attract good people to a profession that is financially very troubled with dire implications, I would say, for democracies. On that depressing note, thank you very much.
So we'll take one or two questions from the audience because it is such an amazing topic, and I'm afraid we don't have that much time. Yeah.
Hi.
Paul or David, do you want to sit here? Do you feel more comfortable sitting here?
Hi. My name is Melanie Takafman, former employee of David's and independent media consultant. I have a question for both of you, actually. I also blog on the Times of Israel, and I think that sort of the openness of the marketplace of ideas and all the commenters and all this is definitely the good overrides the bad. But I wanted to know how do you draw the line between constructive discussion and the commenters who are really, I think, malicious and sort of just spew out all sorts of things and could be very hurtful and even destructive.
Okay, hi, Melanie. When we set up the blog platform initially, you're talking about the bloggers themselves and/or the commenters on the blogs, both.
No, I'm mostly talking about the commenters because I know that there were instances of the specific bloggers, but because the site gets so
Right.
many comments.
Okay, good. So, as far as first of all, in terms of blogs, we're pretty open. Although we now vet both the bloggers and individual blog posts, which became a necessity because there is so much malice and there is quite sophisticated malice out there. That extends to comments as well. You can't comment on the Times of Israel. Other people run their platforms differently unless you're logged in through Facebook or some other, and we have a report abuse function. And I wanted to believe that would be enough. That I thought if your little face is next to what you're writing, you wouldn't write really horrifically terrible things. Turns out that's not true at all.
No.
So we have the report abuse function that you have. Those were our two things. You can report abuse and you can only comment next to your face and therefore you're tracked downable and so on. I think there's an open question about responsibilities of publications in a world where the degree of toxicity and evil is staggering. And I don't have an answer, but I kind of endorse the concern, if you like. Last summer, for example, our traffic quintupled. Okay, and I'm not saying, I think the traffic on every Israeli website quintupled or something, so that wasn't a Times of Israel thing. And we were exposed to hatred of an order that I didn't even know existed. And I'm an old person, and I'm pretty cynical. And there are things that are the responsibility of journalists and website editors and newspaper editors, and then there's the question of what on earth is wrong with humankind. And the answer to your question lies somewhere between those. Because, my goodness, who are these people, and what are they? What's happened to them? I don't know if you.
Paul.
I think there's very little to add to that because I guess there are some regulatory frameworks, of course, in the UK, and again, I'm regularly asked by newspaper proprietors, ought we to moderate comments? What's our legal responsibility? And some will err on the side of caution. Others will allow people to self-moderate and then end up in the same experience that David's just shared and found that they too have lost their faith in human nature. And then, of course, we'll remove comments and then get a whole other tirade of people claiming that they're somehow stifling kind of debate rather than actually trying to stem racial or abuse, basically. So I think the pragmatic response is the one that David's offered you in the kind of here, to raise that question of an unanswered question. What is the best and most appropriate kind of form of enabling a plurality of voices online without and taking an ethical position? And we were listening to that yesterday morning about, if a comment goes too far, and again, it's all a very, very subjective thing, I know, but let's have the guts to remove it and not allow that person to continue to sort of perpetrate those kind of values, because they clearly need help somewhere else, I think.
Can I ask just a little question with regard to that? Whom do you think should be responsible for that? Should that be like a certain newspaper, online website, the editor, or an international company like Facebook, who also has a policy of removing harmful content?
Well, again, in the UK, the regulations are kind of pretty clear. They reside with, if you've suggested as part of your policy that you will moderate comments and then that bad stuff goes up there, that you as the publisher are responsible for that. I guess the broader question of if you've decided to have a hands-off approach, you're not the publisher, it's around the platform. I don't know of any test cases yet in UK law where a large publisher like or a platform host, be that a Google or a Facebook, has actually been successfully tried and tested on that one. So,
Okay.
no answer yet.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, all of you. My name is Sriram. I am from India. I have few questions and comments on big data. Big data is a good resource for journalists. In India, as we observed, the big data brought a new kind of journalism called hybrid journalism. Means journalism, public relations, and corporate communications. And these three are mixing, and they are showing impact on mainstream journalism and mainstream journalists. Whenever a journalist or a media agency, a newspaper, they need some information, just they are ordering the agency which is serving for these three, journalism and public relations and corporate communications, and they are sending information, and inside journalists, they are sitting in the room, they write stories and they interpret in different ways. That is one thing. Coming to the big data, the data protection and data privacy and the privacy of individuals is a big question for journalists when we are dealing with the big data resources. So how to deal all these things in the present scenario?
I'm not quite, forgive me, I'm not quite sure I understand all the strands of the question. Yeah, I think when we talk about big data in the context, and Tehilla ought to probably come in here as well, where she's presented us with open data, of course, that data that's the government are either just desperately trying to get online, or in our case, in our country, they're incentivized to do that. Our local authorities are given money from central government to put more of their data online in kind of open formats. They're then doing that, and what we are finding is that interface between they're doing that and they're reducing the number of public relations officers in local councils and saying, just have a look online, help yourself, it's all online. But it's all online in a way that most journalists can't understand it or interpret it or analyse it, just because, not because they're not smart, but because they haven't got the appropriate skills to do that. We're not asking journalists, well, I certainly wouldn't as an academic, be asking journalists to breach data protection or confidentiality agreements without a much, much higher public interest issue at stake, in which case that would go to the lawyers and up the editorial chain of command, and that would sit on David's desk, I would imagine.
Yeah, just one more question. Yeah, one last one.
Hi, hello, I'm Cherry Mondozi. I come from Press Council of Kosovo. My question for the panelists is, can we try not compete with online media? Like when we are newspapers, can we try and see that we are losing or we lost? Or can we try and concentrate on differentiating ourselves and producing something really more quality? Like quality journalism in terms of writing analytical texts, or really offering the ones who really know how to value the journalistic values. An online portal produces a piece of news that doesn't answer one of the 5 W's, traditional W's, 5 Y's. So let the newspaper answer the 5 W's, and those who want those 5 will find them in newspaper and not compete, not fight a battle that is lost in the very beginning.
A quick response by each one of you, and then we're
Yeah,
going to close it.
I don't think that we need to admit defeat, and I think that we can do both. In other words, we can tell people that something just happened that maybe doesn't give you the tools to understand why and when it's going to happen again and in what context it occurred. And you know, I'm speaking very personally about a site that I operate. At the same time, we can produce material that allows people to interpret the fast-breaking reality. I don't think you have to admit defeat and you have to close off to the possibilities, right? The incredible possibilities that the immediacy that technology gives us. I think you can do both. We had a war last year. I'm running an English language website, and we were live blogging the war. And it became clear to us that people were actually relying on the blooming Times of Israel to know that there'd been a rocket or there was an alarm. And in other words, we became, during the war last summer, an urgent supplier of basic life and death information in a way that I did not dream that anyone would need to use us. That wasn't the key function that we were providing by any means. At the same time, though, we were producing lots of material that enabled people to understand why we're in a war, should we be in a war, were we fighting this war effectively? So I think you can do everything. I think, you know, I spoke very negatively about the profession, because I think the profession is in economic and therefore real crisis. But technology has given us all sorts of opportunities, and I don't think we need to be negative about that at all.
Paul?
I would be very, very difficult to add to that. I think I don't think it needs. Do I need to say any more? I don't think I do, actually.
Perfectly fine.
Perfect.
I guess the audience is going to be happy about
It was
that.
an optimistic thing
but
to end on. Yeah.
we were left with lots of opening questions. For instance, what are the threats for freedom of the press that are unique to the digital era? What are the ways to face them? I think a bigger question is what are the main fields where new, perhaps, state intervention is needed? For instance, is it going to be privacy, protecting journalistic privacy, source protection? What about the state-centered regulation in an international companies world? So many open questions and so few answers, but the future is ahead of us, and thank you all for joining us for this session.
Thank you, Tehilla, and thank you, Paul and David, for, I think, an exciting session